I always thought being home alone would be amazing. I had finally convinced my parents to let me stay by myself while they took my brother to an event I had zero interest in attending. It was just another Sunday, but to me, it felt like the most exciting day in the world. The house was quiet, and I loved the feeling of freedom. There was no one to tell me what to do, no schedule to follow. The couch was all mine, the remote too, and I even considered ordering a pizza just for myself. Being able to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, the feeling was indescribable. As the hours passed, I started to get bored. I scrolled through my phone, watched a few videos, but nothing seemed to hold my attention for long. That's when I got a message from a friend inviting me to hang out. My parents had been clear, don't leave the house. But in my mind, it was just a minor transgression, something they would never find out about. Besides, I'd be back before them, and everything would be exactly as they left it. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my things and headed out the front door, feeling the cool breeze outside. The sense of freedom only grew. What I didn't realize, though, was that in my haste, I had forgotten to lock the door behind me. At that moment, the last thing on my mind was that something could go wrong. I was just enjoying that sweet taste of independence, unaware that I was about to experience one of the most terrifying moments of my life. When I returned home, the sun was already setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I was in a good mood, laughing to myself at the jokes my friend had told. I climbed the steps to the porch, and it was only then that I noticed the door was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I immediately tried to remember if I had locked the door before leaving, but I couldn't even recall if I had closed it properly. It must have been the wind, I thought, trying to convince myself there was no reason to worry. But something inside me was off. A strange unease started forming in my stomach, a gut feeling I couldn't shake. I pushed the door open and stepped inside slowly. The house was silent, but not the comforting silence from before. It was a heavy, oppressive silence. I stood in the entryway, trying to identify what was bothering me so much. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. I took a few steps inside, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I noticed the first thing out of place. The kitchen cabinet was open. I was certain I had left it closed. I looked around and saw that other cabinets were open too, as if someone had gone through them. Some utensils were out of their drawers, scattered across the counter. My heart started to race. I walked into the living room and saw that some objects were out of place. The sofa cushions weren't as I had left them, and the coffee table was slightly askew. It wasn't anything so obvious that someone else would notice immediately, but I knew how I had left everything before I went out. With each new detail I discovered, the unease inside me grew. It felt as if there was an invisible presence, something I couldn't see but knew was there, watching me. Part of me wanted to run outside and never come back, but another, more rational part of me tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that nothing was really wrong. But deep down I knew something was very wrong, and the worst was yet to come. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm my pounding heart. It's all fine, I told myself quietly. It must have been the wind that opened the cabinets, or maybe I left everything out of place without realizing. But those words felt empty, as if I was trying to convince myself of something I knew wasn't true. As I tried to regain control, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The unexpected sound made me jump, and it took a second to collect myself before pulling out the phone. It was an unknown number. I frowned, hesitating for a moment, but decided to answer. Maybe it was a friend playing a prank, or perhaps even my parents calling from a different phone. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shakier than I'd like. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. I could hear slow, heavy breathing, almost as if the person was very close to the phone. The sound was deep, almost animalistic, and it chilled me to the bone. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound firm, but my voice faltered at the end. The silence continued, only interrupted by that disturbing breathing. I started to get irritated. "If this is a joke, it's not funny," I said, trying to hide the fear growing inside me. But the response was just more silence. I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of anger and discomfort. "Idiot," I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the shiver running down my spine. But before I could process what had just happened, the phone rang again. The same unknown number. This time my heart raced and my hand shook as I answered. "Who are you?" I asked again, trying to sound more aggressive than before. But again, all I heard was that heavy breathing, as if the person was savoring the fear they were causing me. I started sweating, each second of silence stretching out like an eternity. I knew I should hang up, block the number, do anything to end this, but something held me back. It was like I was trapped, waiting for the person on the other end to finally say something. And then, after what felt like hours, the call dropped. The silence in the house felt even heavier than before, as if the walls were closing in around me. I looked around. Every shadow and every dark corner of the house seemed to be hiding something. My mind started racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. When the phone rang for the third time, my body reacted before my mind. I answered, my voice now little more than a desperate whisper. "What do you want?" The breathing on the other end was slower now, almost methodical. I could feel the fear creeping along my skin like a cold knife. For a moment, I thought I heard a low, almost imperceptible laugh. And then, before I could process anything, the line went dead again. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, as if waiting for something, anything, to break the overwhelming silence. But the only thing I heard was the muffled sound of my own heartbeat, echoing in the emptiness of the house. The prank had gone too far. I was starting to question my own safety. And as much as I wanted to believe it was just a stupid joke, something in the back of my mind whispered that I was about to discover otherwise. I could barely think straight. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it echoed through the entire house. With every small noise, my head turned in the direction of the sound, as if I was expecting something horrible to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Then the phone rang again. My entire body tensed up. I didn't want to answer, but it was as if my hands had a mind of their own. I picked up the phone with trembling fingers, the unknown number glowing on the screen like a curse. I answered, my heart in my throat. "Hello?" My voice came out as a whisper, laden with fear and desperation. For a moment, all I heard was that slow, heavy breathing again. I felt sweat drip down my forehead, and my mouth went dry. I was about to scream, to demand that this person reveal themselves, when I finally heard a voice. It was low and rough, as if the person was forcing the words out. "I'm in the house." My blood ran cold. A wave of fear so intense washed over me that I almost dropped the phone. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. Suddenly, I heard a sound from upstairs. It was a creak, like someone walking across the floor above. With each step, the floor groaned under the weight, and I felt the floor beneath my feet vibrate slightly. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly, almost deliberately, as if they knew I was listening. My body finally reacted, and I started to back away, not sure exactly where to go. Every step I took seemed to bring me closer to danger, but standing still wasn't an option. I didn't want to believe someone was actually in the house, but the sounds didn't lie. They were getting closer, inching toward the stairs that led to the ground floor. The voice in my head screamed for me to run, but the reality of what was happening kept me rooted in place. How could someone have gotten into my house without me noticing? How could everything have been so quiet, so normal, until that moment? I was about to completely lose control when I heard a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. The sound was followed by rapid footsteps, almost like a run. I didn't need anything else to convince me that this was real, that I was in danger. I knew I had to get out, but I had no idea how. My eyes darted around the room, trying to find a way out, a place to hide, anything. But there was nowhere that seemed safe. My only option was to run. I bolted toward the front door, my heart racing with every step. The sounds from upstairs grew louder and faster, like whoever was up there knew I was trying to escape. I reached the door, my hands fumbling with the lock, my entire body shaking with fear. I had just managed to unlock the door when I heard the last sound I would have expected, the unmistakable growl of a dog. I stopped, confused and scared, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The growl was deep, angry, and it seemed to reverberate through the house. But there was no dog in my house, no pet that could make that noise. The growl got louder, more menacing, as if whatever was making it was approaching fast. My fear hit a peak as I turned around, expecting to see some horrific creature coming after me. But there was nothing. The growl, however, didn't stop. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The entire house seemed to shake with the sound, and I felt like I was losing my mind. The overwhelming feeling of being hunted, of something terrible lurking just out of sight, was too much. I had to get out. I threw the door open and ran outside, the growl echoing in my ears as I sprinted down the street, not daring to look back. My only thought was to get as far away from that house as possible. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were about to give out. Only then did I dare to slow down and look back. The house was just a distant silhouette now, dark and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. Something was in that house, something that had been waiting for me, something that wasn't human. And whatever it wasn't done with me yet. I kept running, not sure where to go, just knowing I needed to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but nothing added up. What had I let into my house? What was that voice on the phone? And that growl? It was like nothing I had ever heard before, like it came from something not of this world. By the time I finally stopped running, I was in a part of town I didn't recognize. I collapsed on a bench, my entire body shaking from exhaustion and fear. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed my parents' number. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. I left a voicemail, my voice barely holding together as I tried to explain what had happened, begging them to come home immediately. But as soon as I hung up, the phone rang again, the same unknown number. My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, the fear paralyzing me. I wanted to ignore it, to throw the phone away and never hear that voice again, but I couldn't move. My thumb hovered over the screen, and before I knew it, I had answered. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper, as if saying anything louder might provoke whatever was on the other end. This time, there was no breathing, no growling, just silence. A silence so deep it felt like the entire world had gone quiet. And then, finally, the voice spoke again. "You can't escape." I dropped the phone, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst. I jumped up and ran again, not knowing where I was going, not caring. The only thought in my mind was to get away, as far away as possible. But deep down, I knew. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was after me, whatever I had let in, wasn't bound by the walls of that house. It was with me now, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. And as I ran through the dark streets, the only thing I could think of was that this was just the beginning. It was a strange feeling to see them leave. My wife, with that worried look, trying not to show she was uneasy about leaving me alone for a few days. The kids, who always filled the house with noise and energy, finally quieted down in the back seat of the car, already imagining the adventures of the trip. I watched them from the window until the car disappeared around the bend, leaving only the echo of the engine and soon after, an absolute silence. What hit me first was the stillness. The house, which was usually full of life and laughter, now seemed like a completely different place. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was heavy, dense, almost suffocating. I walked through the rooms, trying to get used to this new temporary reality. Everything was in its place, but somehow everything felt out of place. The absence of the kids' voices, the familiar sound of my wife's footsteps down the hallway, even the hum of the TV. All of it was now gone, and the house revealed itself in its true form. Big, empty, almost oppressive. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, tidying up the kitchen, organizing some papers in the office, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The clock seemed to move slowly, each second dragging towards the night that would soon arrive. And it did, as it always does. Darkness fell over the house, and the silence, which was merely uncomfortable before, became almost deafening. I sat in the living room trying to relax, but I felt something strange in the air, as if the house itself was watching my every move. It was then that I noticed the window. I am absolutely sure that I closed it earlier, double-checked it, as I always do. But now, there it was, slightly open, letting a faint cold draft in. I stood there, staring at that small gap, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe I had made a mistake. Perhaps I hadn't locked it completely. I closed the window firmly, trying to push away the growing discomfort. I went upstairs to the bedroom, leaving the hallway light on, something I usually don't do, but now seemed necessary. As I lay down, trying to find comfort in the warmth of the covers, the image of that open window wouldn't leave my mind. And it was at that moment, in the dim light of the room, that a small voice at the back of my mind began to whisper, "Something isn't right here." On the second night, the sounds began. I was lying in bed, still a bit unsettled by the window incident the night before. The house seemed to have a life of its own, a rhythm I only started to notice when the silence became so overwhelming. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a product of my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone in a place that's usually full of people. That's when I heard it for the first time, a soft sound, almost like someone walking down the hallway. My heart raced, but I remained still, ears straining. It could be the house settling, or maybe the wind, but it felt different. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. I stayed motionless for a few minutes, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to stop or repeat. But nothing else happened. Finally, I decided to get up and investigate. I walked through the house cautiously, as if expecting to find something hidden in the shadows. The hallway was empty, of course, as was the living room and kitchen. No sign of intruders or anything out of the ordinary. I returned to bed, trying to calm my mind, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Something was bothering me, but I couldn't pinpoint what. On the third night, the sounds repeated, but this time they were more intense. Footsteps, clearly moving from one room to another. This time, I couldn't ignore them. I got up immediately and turned on all the lights in the house. Again, there was nothing, but the sound continued, always at the edge of hearing, as if it was taunting me, daring me to find its source. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The basement door, which always stayed open, was now locked. I frowned, certain that I never locked it. Who would lock a door from the inside? I tried the handle, but it was firmly shut, as if someone was holding it from the other side. A chill ran down my spine. It was becoming clear that something was really wrong. Suddenly, I felt like I wasn't alone in the house anymore. There was a presence, something invisible and unknown, that seemed to be watching me, lurking, waiting. I spent the rest of the night on the living room sofa, unable to go back to the bedroom. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. Every creak or groan of the house made my body tense, waiting for something I couldn't define. The night finally passed, but the fear that had taken hold of me didn't dissipate with the light of day. I knew that something was lurking, something I couldn't see but was certainly there. And for the first time, I began to wonder what could be moving in the darkness of that house and what it wanted from me. The following nights brought a series of increasingly strange events. The house, which had previously been just a bit unsettling, now seemed to be transforming into something different, almost alive. The sounds became more frequent, but they weren't just footsteps. It was as if the entire house was moving, as if every wall and piece of furniture was conspiring to create a cacophony of inexplicable noises. It all started with the lights. They flickered without warning, plunging the rooms into brief moments of total darkness, only to return with a nearly painful intensity. At first, I thought it might be an electrical problem, something I could fix. But soon I realized it was more than that. No matter how many times I checked the bulbs or fuses, the phenomenon continued, always when I least expected it, always when I began to relax. The appliances began to act strangely too. The television would turn on and off by itself, alternating between static and unknown channels I had never tuned into. The microwave started working on its own, its buttons flashing as if they were being pressed by invisible hands. Even the radio in the kitchen, an old device we barely used, began emitting strange sounds, a deep hiss that set my nerves on edge. But what really got to me were the objects. Small things that disappeared and reappeared in strange places, as if someone was playing tricks on me. The car keys, which I always left on the entryway table, one day were in the bathroom, on the sink. The TV remote, usually next to the sofa, was found in the kitchen freezer. Each new incident increased the feeling that I was losing control, that the house was wrapping me in its own web. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. At any moment, I felt eyes on me, as if the house itself was watching. In the corners of my vision, shadows moved, always fleeting, always too quick to be caught directly. When I turned, of course, nothing was there, but the discomfort remained, growing stronger. Then I found the first tangible proof that something or someone was really in the house. I was trying to organize the mess in the office when I noticed something strange on the window. Fingerprints, clearly visible on the dusty glass. But these marks weren't on the outside, as you'd expect, but on the inside, as if someone had been watching the garden from within my house, pressing their hands against the glass. My heart froze at the sight. I ran my hand over the marks, feeling the slight indentations that indicated they were real, not a figment of my imagination. But what disturbed me even more was the height of the marks. They were much lower than what would be normal for an adult. Were they from a child, or from something that didn't want to be seen? I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I hurried out, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up as if I was being followed. When I entered the living room, something on the floor caught my attention. A piece of paper, carefully folded, that I was sure I hadn't left there. I picked up the paper with trembling hands, slowly unfolding it. The message was short, written in a hurried, almost childlike scrawl. "You are not alone." I dropped the paper as if it was burning. The horror of the situation became almost unbearable. I wasn't just imagining things, I wasn't going crazy. Something was here, with me, and it seemed to be getting closer. I woke up that morning with the feeling that everything around me was falling apart. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape from. The events of the previous nights began to weigh heavily on my mind, to the point where I started to doubt my own sanity. But that note, the fingerprints on the window, they were real, weren't they? I needed proof. I couldn't keep questioning myself like this. So, that day, I installed security cameras at strategic points around the house. If there was something, anything moving around, I would capture it. I spent hours adjusting the cameras, trying to cover every corner. It was a desperate need to regain control, as if the cameras were the only thing that could protect me from this invisible presence. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the monitor connected to the cameras, watching the house through cold, impersonal lenses. The hours passed slowly, the screen flickering from one room to another, always showing the same stillness, the same oppressive silence. It was around 2 a.m. that I saw it. In the kitchen, near the sink, something moved. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable, passed quickly in front of the camera. My heart raced as I watched the screen intensely, praying for the shadow to reappear. But nothing happened. The kitchen returned to its usual stillness, and I was left staring at the empty room, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. I reviewed the footage over and over, frame by frame. The shadow was there, a dark blur in the corner of the screen, something moving quickly out of view. But what was it? A person? An animal? Or something else entirely? Determined to find an answer, I left the monitor and headed to the kitchen, trying to match the location of the shadow with something real. The kitchen was quiet, the lights dim. The only sound was my own breathing. I checked every corner, every possible hiding spot, but there was nothing. No sign of intruders, no footprints, nothing out of place. But as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. A small object on the floor, near the pantry. It was a child's toy, one I didn't recognize, one that certainly didn't belong to my kids. A small, worn-out doll with a creepy smile and empty eyes lying on the cold tiles. I picked up the doll with trembling hands, feeling its weight, its coldness. Who had put it there? And why? Suddenly, I heard a sound, a soft but clear noise, like someone whispering right next to my ear. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty, the shadow gone, the air thick with silence. But the whisper continued, faint but unmistakable, repeating the same word over and over. Leave. I dropped the doll and backed away, my heart pounding. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost a scream. Leave. Without thinking, I ran out of the kitchen, through the hallway, and out of the house. The cold night air hit my face, but I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath. I looked back at the house, now dark and silent, and for the first time I felt an overwhelming urge to abandon it, to get as far away as possible. But I couldn't. I had to find out what was happening, what was trying to drive me away. But deep down, I knew that the house wasn't going to give up that easily. It was playing a game with me, a game I wasn't sure I could win. The next night I made a decision. I couldn't run, couldn't hide. If something was trying to drive me away, then I had to face it. I spent the day preparing myself, gathering everything I might need. Flashlights, matches, a knife for protection, anything that made me feel less helpless. When night fell, I was ready. I sat in the living room, waiting for the darkness to come, for the house to reveal its secrets. The silence was overwhelming, but this time, I didn't let it scare me. I was determined to confront whatever was in my home, no matter what. It didn't take long for the noises to start again. The footsteps, the whispers, the flickering lights. But this time, I didn't react with fear. I got up slowly, following the sounds through the house, moving closer to the source of the disturbances. They led me to the basement door. The door was still locked, just as it had been before. But this time I didn't hesitate. I forced the door open with all my strength, the wood creaking and groaning under the pressure. Finally, it gave way, and I descended into the basement, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with a musty smell. But as I moved the beam of light across the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner, there was a figure, tall, shadowy, almost blending with the darkness. It was standing still, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, oppressive and menacing. The air grew colder, and the whispers began again, filling the room with an eerie chorus of voices. Leave, leave. I took a step back, fear gripping me, but then something snapped inside me. I wasn't going to let this thing, whatever it was, control me anymore. I raised the knife, ready to defend myself, ready to fight. But before I could move, the figure disappeared. The darkness swallowed it whole, leaving me alone in the basement. The whispers stopped, and the room returned to silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The figure was gone, but the fear remained. I knew it wasn't over. The house wasn't done with me yet. I climbed back up the stairs, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here, couldn't continue this game. The house had won. Whatever was haunting it was beyond my understanding, beyond my ability to fight. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit my face, bringing with it a sense of finality. I looked back at the house one last time, its dark windows staring back at me, and I knew that I had to leave. This place wasn't my home anymore. It had become something else, something twisted and malevolent. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The house faded into the distance, but the fear, the memories of what had happened, stayed with me. I don't know where I'll go or what I'll do next, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never set foot in that house again. It's not just a house anymore. It's something much worse, and whatever it is, it's still there, waiting for its next victim. My name is Lucas, and when everything happened, I was just a teenager, living with my parents in a big, somewhat isolated house in the middle of a forest. The house was far from everything, with the nearest neighbors a good few minutes away. We had a long, winding driveway that cut through the woods before reaching the house. I used to like that. It might be a little scary for some people, but for me, it was peaceful. I was already used to being home alone, especially when my parents traveled for work. The house was big, with 2 floors, and most nights were quiet. It was the kind of place where you could hear the sound of crickets and the branches swaying in the wind. I even enjoyed that peace. It felt like the world outside didn't matter. But that night, things were different. The silence felt heavier. I was alone in my room on the 2nd floor, and I started to feel an unusual restlessness. It was as if the air was denser, almost pressing down on me. Every time the house creaked, I shuddered. It was already late, and the moonlight was streaming through the windows, casting strange shadows everywhere. Suddenly, I started to feel like there was someone out there, watching me. The house that had always felt so safe suddenly seemed too big, too empty. While I was in my room, trying to ignore that strange feeling, I heard a sound that made my heart stop for a second. Voices. Men's voices outside, near the entrance to the house. I got out of bed and went to the window, trying not to make any noise. I peeked through the curtain and saw a group of men standing at our driveway. There were about 4 or 5 of them, all dressed in dark clothes, smoking and talking quietly. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could tell their accent was foreign, different from what I was used to. They laughed occasionally, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was low, almost as if they were trying not to draw attention. The way they looked at the house made me tense. They were scanning every corner, as if they were analyzing, planning something. The nervousness started to build. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that maybe they were lost or just looking for someone, but I couldn't believe that. They didn't seem to be there by accident. I started to sweat, and my heart began to pound so hard it felt like it was echoing through the house. Then a thought hit me like a punch in the stomach: the front door. I wasn't sure if I had locked the front door. In the rush to get upstairs, maybe I had left it unlocked. That sinking feeling in my stomach only grew worse. If the door was open, these guys could come in at any moment. I needed to do something, but my legs felt glued to the floor. Fear was paralyzing me, but I knew I couldn't just stand there. I had to check the door, but every second I hesitated, it felt like the men were getting closer to doing something. A cold wave of fear swept over me when I realized the front door was unlocked. It was as if all the blood had drained from my face, leaving me dizzy and with my mind racing. How could I be so stupid? I always locked the door, but that night, in my hurry to get upstairs, I had forgotten. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to run downstairs, lock the door before they had a chance to come in. But another part, the more terrified part, told me to stay where I was, to hide, maybe even pretend no one was home. My heart was pounding so fast I could feel every beat in my throat. My breathing became shallow, and I started to sweat even more. I looked out the window again, trying to figure out what they were doing. That's when I saw one of the men pointing directly at the house. He said something to the others, and I watched him start to move, slowly but determinedly, toward our door. Panic took over. My mind screamed that I needed to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. I could hear the noise of my thoughts, a million ideas and fears colliding all at once. Did he know the door was unlocked? Was he going to try to get in? I couldn't wait any longer. If I didn't lock the door now, there wouldn't be another chance. I needed to make a decision, and fast. With fear gripping my chest, I decided to go down and lock the door. I couldn't just stand there waiting for the worst to happen. I needed to act, even though my legs were trembling like they were about to give out at any moment. I opened my bedroom door very slowly, trying not to make any noise. The house was engulfed in darkness, with long shadows stretching across the walls. Every step I took made the wooden floor creak beneath my feet, which only made the knot in my stomach tighten. It felt like the sound echoed through the entire house, as if it was screaming to the men outside that I was moving. As I descended the stairs, I forced myself to take deep breaths, but each breath only made my heart beat faster. The sounds outside became clearer, the voices of the men now closer, mixed with the sound of the wind rustling the trees. I was halfway to the door when one of the shadows in the hallway seemed to move, and I almost screamed. But it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks, amplifying the fear. Finally, I reached the bottom of the stairs and could see the front door, a dark silhouette against the faint moonlight coming through the windows. A few meters from it, I heard a sound that made the ground disappear from under my feet. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, climbing onto the porch, each one closer than the last. I was seconds away from locking the door, but each second felt like an eternity. Time seemed to stretch, and fear paralyzed me once again. I knew that if I didn't move quickly, they would be inside the house before I could do anything. The fear of being seen, of being caught, was overwhelming, but I knew I had no choice. I needed to lock that door. Part 5. The conclusion. When I reached the door, my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the key. My heart felt like it was about to explode, but I knew I couldn't afford to make a mistake. I managed to insert the key into the lock, and at the exact moment I turned it, I heard the sound of the bolt sliding into place. A second later, what I feared most happened. The doorknob began to turn. Someone outside was trying to get in. For a moment I was completely still, the sound of the doorknob moving thunderous in my head. Then finally, it hit me, and I stumbled backward, almost tripping. I ran down the hallway and hid behind the couch, curling up as small as I could. I could hear the men outside talking, their voices frustrated, confused. One of them tried the door again, but when it didn't open, he began pounding on the wood, hard. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. My voice came out in desperate whispers as I explained the situation, trying to stay calm. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was and that a patrol car was on its way, but every second felt like an eternity. As I waited, I heard the men outside arguing, the sound of footsteps going back and forth on the porch. They tried to force the door a few more times, but when they realized it was locked, they started cursing. And finally, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps moving away. I stayed there, motionless, my heart still racing, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for them to come back. But after a while, everything went silent again. I didn't know if they had really left or if they were hiding, waiting to catch me by surprise. Finally, the lights of the sirens cut through the darkness outside, and I heard the police arrive. I got up, my legs barely holding me, and went to the door to meet the officers. They searched the area, but as I had feared, the men were already gone. I explained what happened, and they stayed for a while, making sure the perimeter was secure, but deep down, I knew they couldn't stay forever. I thanked them, and when they finally left me alone again, I closed all the doors and windows, locking each one twice. Even though I was safe for now, the fear still gripped me. What did those men want? Why were they so determined to get in? As I curled up on the couch, the thought that they might come back kept me awake for hours, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the slightest sign that they were back. I knew that even with the police nearby, the sense of security I once had would never be the same. It was one of those perfect days. The sun was shining, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and a gentle breeze made the curtains sway softly. I was home, alone, enjoying the peace and quiet that I rarely had. I had just made a snack and threw myself onto the living room couch, feeling the warmth of the sun streaming through the windows. For a few minutes, I just lay there, savoring the tranquility. There was nothing wrong. Everything was as it should be. The house was quiet. The only sound was the birds singing outside. I decided to get up and take a look out the front window, for no particular reason, just to watch the world outside. That's when I saw him. A man was walking down the sidewalk on the other side of the street with a dog beside him. Nothing unusual, but something about the scene made me stop. He was dressed simply, but there was something about him that didn't seem to fit. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was, maybe the way he walked or the fact that the dog seemed odd, but I didn't pay much attention at the time. I thought I was just imagining things. I kept watching for a few more seconds, waiting for the man and the dog to continue on their way. But when I blinked and looked back, they had already turned the corner and disappeared. The feeling of discomfort lingered for a moment, but I soon shook my head and returned to the couch. There was no reason to worry. After all, it was just a perfect day, nothing more. I was almost dozing off on the couch when my phone buzzed. I picked it up and saw that it was a message from my dad. He asked me to check if the mail had arrived. I sighed, somewhat reluctantly, but decided to get up. I wasn't in the mood to leave my comfort zone, but I knew it would be better to take care of it right away. I walked to the front door, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. When I got there, peeking through the frosted glass of the door, my heart skipped a beat. There was a shadow there, outside. It was a human figure, accompanied by a dog. I found it strange because, through the glass, I usually could see the colors of the clothes or some detail, but this shadow was different. It was completely black, as if someone was standing there, but without a defined form, just a dark outline. For a moment, I froze. My mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just someone passing by, maybe the light was creating some illusion. But the figure was there, unmoving, as if it was waiting for me. My instincts told me not to open the door, but what else could I do? I wasn't expecting anyone, and I wasn't expecting any deliveries either. With my hand on the handle, I hesitated for a second. I decided to take a step back and look again through the window, but as soon as I turned my head, the shadow was gone. I didn't hear any footsteps, didn't hear anything. I just looked out the window and saw that the man and the dog had vanished. Suddenly, the feeling of discomfort returned, stronger this time. I quickly shut the door and went back inside, trying to understand what had just happened. I stood still for a moment, my hand still on the door handle, trying to process what had just happened. The shadow had simply vanished, as if it had never been there. I didn't know if I was starting to imagine things, or if something truly strange was happening. I went back to the living room, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a coincidence, maybe I was just overreacting. But something didn't feel right, and I knew it. A shiver ran down my spine, that feeling that something was wrong, even though I couldn't exactly explain what. I went to the living room window and looked outside, hoping to see the man and the dog again, but there was no one on the street. The sidewalk was completely deserted. I looked in all directions, but they had simply disappeared. My mind started racing with possibilities. What if the shadow wasn't of a man? What if it wasn't something normal? But I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts away. I never believed in those things. I've always been the skeptical type. Still, I couldn't help the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I decided I needed to do something to get this idea out of my head. I went to the kitchen, trying to occupy myself with anything, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me alone. The house, once so calm and safe, now felt different, almost threatening. I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow. How could it have disappeared so quickly? I stood there in the kitchen, trying to find an answer, but none made sense. I looked toward the door once more, hoping to see something, anything, but everything was quiet. The silence was almost deafening. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore, but at the same time, the house seemed empty. The idea that there was something beyond the door, something that shouldn't be there, made me increasingly nervous. And then, it was as if a part of me knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of discomfort remained. And for some reason, I knew that was just the beginning. After a few minutes in the kitchen, trying to distract my mind, I started to notice strange things that didn't seem to fit. The first thing that caught my attention was the cabinet door. I was sure it was closed when I left the kitchen, but now it was ajar. I frowned, wondering if I had really left it like that, or if I was starting to lose track of things. I went to the cabinet and closed the door, feeling a slight discomfort. When I turned around, I noticed something else that didn't make sense. The salt shaker that always sat near the stove was now on the opposite counter. That definitely wasn't something I had done. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had moved it and simply forgotten, but the truth was, it was becoming hard to ignore these little details. That feeling of not being alone returned with full force. It was as if the house, my house, was beginning to turn into a place I no longer recognized. Every noise, every creak in the walls seemed amplified, as if it was echoing inside my head. I decided to take a walk around the house, checking if there was anything else out of place. When I entered the hallway, another strange thing caught my attention. The guest room door was open. I never leave that door open. It's a habit of mine to always keep it closed because I almost never use that room. I approached slowly, my heart beating faster with each step. When I reached the door, I looked inside, and everything seemed normal, but the feeling of discomfort was almost unbearable. I quickly closed the door, trying to push away the thought that someone or something had been there. I returned to the living room and looked around. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but I knew something was wrong. I sat down on the couch, trying to organize my thoughts. With every passing second, the feeling that something was out of place only grew stronger. I didn't know what was happening, but I was starting to feel like this was more than just my imagination. The small changes, the open doors, the moved objects, all of it was beginning to form a disturbing picture. And as much as I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, a part of me knew something was seriously wrong. I was trapped in a cycle of unanswered questions, and the more I tried to understand, the more lost I felt. It was as if the house was trying to tell me something, or worse, as if something in it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The tension inside me was almost unbearable. Every little detail I found out of place seemed to pull me closer to a truth I didn't want to face. I knew I needed to do something, but what? The house, once so familiar, now felt strange, as if something was lurking in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. I gathered my courage and decided I needed to face whatever was happening. I went back to the front door, hesitant but determined. I put my hand on the handle, feeling the cold metal against my skin. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to calm my breathing. I knew that opening that door could lead to something that would change everything. With a quick movement, I opened the door and stepped outside. The sun was still shining out there, but the feeling of discomfort didn't diminish. I looked around, expecting to see the shadow again, or any sign of the man and the dog, but everything was calm. There was nothing but silence, the same silence that followed me inside the house. I took a few steps onto the porch, trying to feel something different, but the street was deserted, as if the world had stopped. That persistent discomfort continued to torment me, but there was nothing there, nothing I could see or touch. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but the emptiness that greeted me was almost worse. It was as if the presence I felt inside the house was playing with me, hiding, but always watching. The feeling of being observed didn't go away, and I knew that even out there, I wasn't safe. I went back inside, closing the door behind me with a dry click. The sound echoed through the house, amplifying the feeling of loneliness. My thoughts were in disarray, trying to understand what it all meant. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come to any conclusion that made sense. I sat down on the couch again, my head in my hands. The house was silent, but that silence was deafening. I knew that somehow the shadow hadn't disappeared, just hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. And then, it was as if something inside me finally gave way. I accepted that, whatever it wasn't something I could understand or fight. Maybe it was a part of the house, something that had always been there, dormant. Or maybe it was something I had brought with me, a presence that fed on fear and uncertainty. I don't know what happened after that. The hours blurred together and time seemed to lose its meaning. I just sat there, waiting. But what I was waiting for, even I didn't know. Maybe it was the shadow, or maybe it was just the end of that overwhelming feeling of discomfort. When I finally got up, the house was shrouded in the darkness of night. I didn't know if the shadow would return, or if it was already there somewhere watching, but somehow I knew I would never see the house the same way again. Something had changed, and that feeling of discomfort, of not being alone, would never leave me. I went to my bedroom without looking back, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down my spine. I locked the door, turned off the light, and lay down on the bed, waiting for sleep to take me. But deep down, I knew that the shadow was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. And in that terrifying silence, I fell asleep, knowing that the real terror wasn't in the shadow, but in the fact that it had never really disappeared.